My name's Ben Kolbeck. I'm a Roman historian at the Faculty of Classics here at Cambridge and Director of Studies in Classics at Sydney Sussex College. Um, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about a really fascinating body of evidence from Roman Britain called the Vindolanda Tablets. Some of you might have been to Vindolanda, but I'll recap for those of you who haven't, give a short introduction to this really unique sort of corpus of material. And my aims in doing that are sort of a twofold. Hopefully, both of those will be useful to you. The first is to give you a sense of a body of material that you'd be able to explore on your own terms, with some online tools as well. At the end, I'll show you how to do that as well. In order to find some material to sort of spice up your personal statement, that kind of thing. And I should say, I'm not saying this is not the only kind of material that you could do that with, but to give you a sense of the kinds of tools that are out there for you to start to explore the ancient world independently, which will help that process of showing that you do have a sort of independent interest in the material and have something interesting to say about some sources from the ancient world. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is just to sort of practice and demonstrate this process of reading out from a text and picking up on contextual clues, focusing on particularly interesting passages in order to build some kind of plausible analysis about the context of the piece of evidence and the world that produced it. And the reason why I think that's really important is because that is exactly the kind of exercise that if you apply to Cambridge and get interviewed by a college, that's exactly the kind of thing that the interviewers are going to be looking for in that interview. They're very likely to show you a couple of sources, perhaps a piece of text, perhaps an image of an object or some kind of archaeological evidence, and ask you to do that same kind of thing. So ideally something you haven't seen before, that'll be the idea, and to see how you can sort of build something from it. And that, if you haven't done that before, that can be quite a kind of scary experience. But I think if you know what you're doing, you actually see that it's not about bringing lots of knowledge, exterior knowledge, to the text. It's about reading out. So hopefully that will show what that looks like a little bit today. So we should start off maybe, so as I said, I'm going to be talking about this body of material from Roman Britain. I'm just going to do a very quick sort of whistle-stop tour of the early history of the province of Britain. Some of you might know some of this already, but Britain was the first Roman general to attempt anything militarily on the island was Julius Caesar, who, as part of his Gallic campaigns, made a couple of attempts at landing in the Kent area. Afterwards, he framed that as he was just looking for new information. He was just scouting. Probably he found the local resistance was higher than he expected. But by this point, then the Romans decide not to launch a full-scale invasion at that point. But Britain is steadily coming into the Roman orbit in this period. Traders are having extensive links with Roman commercial forms through Gaul, and local kings, local chieftains in Britain are starting to have diplomatic relations with Roman rulers and actually use some of those diplomatic relations to support their own power. So in this period, several British chieftains mint coins in which they refer to themselves using the Latin word for king, rex, because they've been recognized by Roman officials. But direct military annexation takes a long while to happen from the Roman side. So it's almost a century later until there's another serious attempt to take Britain, and that may have been under the Emperor Caligula. Scholars debate exactly the extent to which that occurred, but finally Claudius, the emperor in the 40s AD, he launches a full-scale invasion. So as I said, about 100 years after Caesar's attempt, and this is successful. This leads to the start of long-term military occupation of Britain. And this is a slow process of sort of pushing steadily north over successive decades. We'll look at some maps in a second that show that. So the core of the province was sort of around London. But the Romans then stayed in Britain from 43 all the way through till about 410 AD, when the legions finally abandoned the island. These are some reliefs from an imperial temple, imperial cult temple in modern day Turkey in Asia Minor. And if you can see on the left here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but on the left here, this is great. This is a panel of showing Claudius, that emperor, a kind of idealized portrait of himself, subjugating a personification of Britain, Britannia. So this is the way in which the conquering of Britain was sort of celebrated around the empire. So this is a little map just to show the first few decades of Roman rule. So the first invasion here, these red arrows around the southeast of the country. And then you can see with it's color-coded here, these kind of subsequent governors took slowly, step by step, increased Roman presence throughout the core of the country, eventually into Wales. And this all, of course, then leads to a big setback in AD 64 when Boudicca revolts. And if we can see Colchester there, so on the right, where that was the capital in this early period, the capital of Roman Britain. But this is when in 64 we get this native revolt. In which the Queen of the Iceni, Boudicca, leads a large army that destroys the major Roman towns of Colchester, London, and St. Albans. When the Roman legions sort of gather themselves, they quickly put this down and then continue expanding throughout the north, particularly under the rule of a particular governor called Agricola, who pushed north from York and into Scotland, and even circumnavigated the very top of the country. But the Romans don't hold on to Scotland because political power there is too diffuse. The tribes, the Scottish tribes, don't really want to cooperate in the same way that some of the more settled tribes in the heartland of Britain cooperated with the Romans. So after defeating the Scottish tribes, the Romans actually pull back. And the frontier sort of stabilizes in what we would now think of as northern England. We get this kind of border zone, which basically runs between Newcastle and Carlisle. There's a little bit of sort of flex back and forwards, but this is basically where it ends up. Then in around about 180, 120 AD is when Hadrian's Wall gets built to sort of fix this border. And that's the map of Hadrian's Wall there you can see on the left. And you can see this Vindolanda is mentioned there. Now, this is obviously a very zoomed out map, but if you can see that red square is just south of Hadrian's Wall, and that is the fort of Vindolanda. Vindolanda, the fort was built, the first iteration of the fort was built in the 80s AD, so during under Agricola's governorship when the border was being pushed north. So Hadrian's Wall didn't exist at that point. Only 40 years later was Hadrian's Wall built about a mile north of this site. But the fort itself continued to be occupied throughout the period that Hadrian's Wall was built and even later. Now, those of you who have been there, you'll have seen this wonderful, nicely excavated site in which the stone phases of the fort are shown. Actually, what I'm going to be talking to you about today is about an early period of the fort, actually before it was rebuilt in stone. And actually, it's the fact that it was built in stone eventually is what preserved what we're going to look at. Because the early decades of the fort, in the late 1st century and very early 2nd century, were all made of wood. And these were conceived of almost as sort of semi-temporary sites where a new unit would come in. They would build a fort very quickly out of wood over a couple of weeks or so. They would stay there for their posting, maybe 5 or 10 years. And when they left, they would tear the fort down and burn it. And then the next unit would come into the same site and build the wooden fort again. Um, and this cycle happened a few times until at some point in the probably late second, early third century, finally the Romans decided, let's stop this cycle of burning down the fort every decade or so, and they built the stone structure that still survives. But this process of tearing down the old fort, burning it, and sort of getting rid of everything, that created a number of burn layers in the ground. So basically sealing what was beneath it. And what was beneath it was very peaty, boggy ground, which was very low in oxygen. And when that was combined with this kind of airtight seal of burned layers on top of it, it created the perfect environment for the preservation of organic material, which very rarely survives. So the organic material, the kind of stuff that you would expect to rot away within, a couple of decades or 100 years if left out. And in most parts of the Roman Empire, that's what happened. But in Vindolanda and only a few other places, we actually get it surviving. And the great treasures, I mean, there are a number of wonderful objects that this particular type of environment preserved for us. But the one I'm going to talk about today are the Vindolanda Tablets. And these are essentially, they are very thin strips of wood, which people used as a writing surface. Now, the normal writing surface in the ancient world was papyrus. This was made from stems of reeds from the Nile, which were pushed together, pasted together very finely, and made a writing surface a little bit like paper. The problem with papyrus is it's produced in Egypt, which means it's big transport costs to move it around the empire, especially if it's coming all the way to Britain. And we have a number of papyri, a very large number of papyrus fragments actually, which survive from Egypt because of how dry it is, but they don't survive anywhere else. So for a long time, people were wondering, well, did people in like Rome and Britain, did they even write documents in the same way as all the documents we have from Rome and Egypt? Then when it turned out, when these started to be uncovered in the 70s, at Vindolanda, we realized actually people everywhere, all across the Roman Empire, they were writing in everything they could get their hands on. And here, the best thing to write on was these very small strips of wood. So what do we see in these texts? It's really this unique cache of material. And again, I want to stress again that this is happening almost certainly everywhere. It's only at Vindolanda it survives. So this is what opens up the possibility that we can do a sort of micro history study on this particular site and suggest some things that are probably going on at many other places, not just elsewhere in Rome and Britain, but potentially all over the empire. So what I'm going to do now is, and I'll try and keep an eye on time as we go through, but I'm just going to take you through some of the what I think are some of the more interesting texts, showing all the different sort of social layers which are represented in this evidence, and thus how we can sort of, we can dig kind of sink a trench through a cross section of this fort community and see everything that's going on in a level of detail that we would simply never get from, for example, literary evidence. So the historians like Tacitus and Livy, for example, recording stuff that they would simply not be interested in. Now, one type of material which, or rather one figure that's very well represented in the evidence is the commander of the fort, who at one point in the very early 2nd century was a man called Flavius Cerialis. Now, the unit that he was commanding was an auxiliary unit, which means it was made up of barbarians from the frontiers of the empire who would be given Roman citizenship when they were discharged. Cerealis was probably from the same tribe, but he had been given Roman citizenship already and was equestrian status. So you can see that this is the way the army is sort of an engine for making new people Roman, in a sense. And we have a large number of letters to or from Cerealis, the commander of the fort in this period. And a large number of them are what we see in this letter, which is a slightly sort of pleading letter of recommendation. This is one thing that Roman elites were very sort of fond of. It's all about social advancement, promotion, and the word of your friends, the word of your recommender, your referee was sort of a big part of that. So a little bit like your, as part of your UCAS application, you'll have a statement from the school saying what a wonderful student this person is. Look at all the stuff they've done. Well, the Romans were exactly the same. This is Cerealis writing to somebody else who we don't know exactly who they were, Crispinus, but who is clearly senior to Cerealis. So perhaps he's a senator or something. And Cerealis is basically sucking up here to Crispinus. So this is the commander of the fort, but here he's sucking up to someone else. And he's saying, I've gladly, sorry, I've got my faces in the way here. I've gladly seized the opportunity, my lord, of greeting you, you who are my lord and the man whom it is my very special wish to be in good health and master of all your hopes. And he goes on and on and on. He talks about the governor as a distinguished man whom Crispinus might intervene on Cerealis' half with. And then at the end, he says, furnish me with very many friends, that thanks to you, I may be able to enjoy a pleasant period of military service. I write this to you from Vindolanda, where my winter quarters are. So I'm not sure Cerealis would have been too happy for us to sort of still be able to see this slightly grasping letter now that he wrote to, a more powerful person asking, please help me, send me, make sure my name is known in high circles. And the subtext, I think, there is hopefully this posting in Northern Britain doesn't last too long and I can go somewhere else nicer soon. But we see the sort of dynamics of of social advancement amongst the ruling class in this period. An interesting thing about the correspondence as well that we see is letters between the families of different commanding officers at different forts along Hadrian's Wall. So as you can imagine, the officers, the commanders, they're not really sort of rubbing shoulders with the rank and file. Who do they have to sort of hang out with and build a social network? It's the other commanders at the forts nearby, up and down the wall. And we see that in the evidence as well. So here is Cerealis writing to somebody called Aelius Brocchus. Brocchus is another prefect, another commander of a different fort somewhere nearby. And Cerealis says to his Brocchus, greetings. If you love me, brother, I ask that you send some hunting nets. You should repair the pieces very strongly. Now he calls him brother here. That's just kind of a social term. Brocchus isn't actually his brother. Soldiers are very, even today, soldiers are very fond of using those kinds of terms, like brother to refer brothers in arms, etc. But here we have two aristocratic military officers writing to each other, and Cerealis is asking here for some hunting equipment. So even while on the northern border, he wants to engage in that traditional aristocratic pastime of going out hunting. He needs equipment for it. He's asking his other aristocratic friend for help. And you can imagine this is the kind of activity which the rank and file is probably not engaging in. So we get a view into how Roman elites are trying to maintain their aristocratic lifestyles, even while they're on this kind of cold, wet, windy bit of the northern border. This is another, we don't talk about this one too much, but this is another one of those recommendation letters. This is Cerealis. He's not writing for himself here. He's writing for someone else, one of his proteges, whom he's recommending to another military officer. So again, we're seeing this kind of this pattern of social advancement by getting powerful people to speak on your behalf. And here he's talking or actually Cerealis is being asked by someone else, commend my friend to a third person, to Annius Aquesta, centurion in charge of the region at Luguralium, which is Carlisle, by doing which you will place me in debt to you, both in his name and my own. So we're seeing this kind of complex economy of favors that elite people are doing for each other, and the way they're maintaining social ties in the frontier region. We also get a sense of how the household of the commander is being managed. So this is a tablet actually from a slightly different layer of the fort, so a different unit. And we read here that this commander, this prefect, a man called Severus, is essentially writing a shopping list here to one of his slaves, saying, go out to the market and buy these items. He says, Severus to Candidus, greetings. Regarding the supplies, presumably, so you can see a lot of these texts have bits broken off that we don't exactly know how to, we don't know what to fill in the gaps, so that's why we get those ... dots every now and again. He said, regarding the food, presumably for the Saturnalia, I ask you, brother, to see them at a price of 4 or 6 asses, and ass is a bronze coin, bronze Roman coin, and radishes to the value of not less than half a denarius. Farewell, brother. To Candidus, slave of Genialis, the prefect, from Severus, slave of ... So actually, these are 2 slaves in the household of the prefect, who are giving each other instructions on buying items for a festival that's coming up. And there's another document that shows the same people saying buy 200 eggs. So quite a lot of a large amount of supplies planning is going into this festival that's coming up, the Saturnalia. And here we get an insight into, I mean, these people are not soldiers, right? They are slaves in the household of the prefect. So we sort of get a sense for the fact that not everybody here is necessarily a soldier, and we'll see that in some of the future evidence as well. I think we get a picture, thinking about the Roman army, that this is a very very kind of regimented, very predictable lifestyle that's all about men, all about soldiers. But actually, that's not the case. There's a big sort of social spread of people. It's a whole society here that we get a view into. And that's brought out by this next letter as well. I'll show you a close-up in a second so you can see what it looks like sort of texture-wise, the actual tablet. But this is one of a body of letters that shows the presence of women at the fort, which before this kind of material started to be unearthed, a lot of historians said, assumed basically that the Roman army was a very male-dominated environment. And in fact, that was sort of legislated for. So in theory, the emperors actually outlawed soldiers from having wives. But this evidence shows us that that's not the case, and that actually in practice, there are lots of women living around the fort as well. And this is a birthday party invitation to the wife of Cerealis. So that the prefect that we met before with his sort of promotion letters, Flavius Cerealis. This is an incoming letter to his wife from another woman called Claudia Serera, who herself was the wife of Aelius Brocchus, that other prefect that Cerealis was writing to. So we're getting a sense of a kind of a network, a quite closely bound network of commanders and their families in the region, who are clearly all calling on each other for social occasions. So here we read Claudia Severa to her Lepidina, that's the wife of Cerealis, greetings. On the 3rd day before the Ides of September, sister, for the day of the celebration of my birthday, I give you a warm invitation to make sure you come to us, to make the day more enjoyable for me by your arrival, if you're present. Give my greetings to your Cerealis, that's the commander. My Aelius, so her husband, the commander of that other fort, and my little son send him greetings. So actually we see that there's whole families living here, perhaps more easier for that to happen when it's the commander's family. He has his kind of villa basically in the middle of the fort with his family there. But we actually see there's a mixed community, more than we might expect. And you can imagine it must be pretty dreary for the family of these officers. And then it says here second hand, which means the editors have noted that the handwriting changes at this point on the tablet. And we read, I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper and hail. And what has happened here, what this means by second hand is up until this point, she was dictating probably to a slave who was writing this down for her. And this is her little signature that she wrote in her own handwriting right at the end, just to say, look, I'm here. This is me. I'm giving you a nice little personalized send off. Yeah, this is a close up of what the tablet actually looks like. And you can see, I mean, very, very thin a piece of material, so not intended, you can't really reuse it. And you can very clearly make out the writing in ink on it there, preserved very, very well. An interesting thing about this tablet, which I won't really be talking about here, but is the fact that this material allows us to see handwritten Latin in a way that we hadn't really done before, and how different it is to our idea of sort of block capitals that we, for instance, get in the manuscripts. This is a very different way, this kind of almost shorthand way of writing Latin, which requires some specialist skills in order to sort of unpick and then work out what is actually being written there. But on that point of sort of children, you might say, well, on the one hand, yeah, okay, it makes sense that perhaps the children of the commander are about. But actually, we have plenty of material evidence that suggests that there were a large number of children at the fort. One of the other types of organic material that survives from Vindolanda are leather items, particularly leather shoes. So any of you who have been to the museum there, you will have seen this amazing wall of leather shoes. Including a large number of children's shoes as well. Very far more than if the only children there were the children of the commander and the other officers. So this is not a sort of regimented, very sort of disciplined, very sort of male-oriented society. But actually, there's lots of it's a much more mixed community in reality than perhaps the rhetoric of the Roman army would suggest. Okay, so going down this kind of social scale, then leaving the officers a little bit behind, and thinking about what else is going on at the fort. Then how can we see that in the evidence? Well, just I mean, this is a very famous tablet, tablet 154. Which is the strength report of the cohort, which gives us sort of overall numbers for the number of troops who are actually there. And this tells us that the first cohort of Tungrians, so which is some tribe across the Danube that we don't know much about. So again, one of these frontiers people who have been who have joined to make a unit, and they will be given Roman citizenship on their discharge. We get told that nominally there should be 752 men in this unit, including 6 centurions, which is funny. It's quite an irregular number, again showing that the reality probably doesn't quite match the rhetoric, because in theory these units should either be 500 men or 1,000 men strong if they're a double cohort. 752 just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So clearly the level of regularity is actually much less in practice than kind of modern reconstructions might like to think. But we see that actually units, men from this unit are split off and are kind of all over the place. So it says that 46 of the people who are enrolled in this unit are currently seconded as guards of the governor, probably down in London. There's 337 of them, so a huge amount, who are somewhere else at the office of Ferox, whoever that is, maybe the procurator, or they're seconded to some other unit. We don't really know the context of that. So then we get this on the right-hand side, total absentees, 456 out of 752. So most of the soldiers are not there. The remaining 296, there's still 300 people here. Of these, 15 of them are sick, 6 of them are wounded, 10 of them have eye inflammation, or rather, sorry, 30. I should have. I don't know where that 31's gone. I've slightly misaligned this text, I think. But anyway, so there's a large number of them who are resting up in the infirmary. Complaints about eye inflammation is very constant in sort of ancient letters and so on. So of these people, there's only 265 who are fit for service. So we get a picture there into all the different jobs, the different places that these soldiers might be, even when theoretically they are at Vindolanda, but actually they're sort of spread all around the country. And then we do have a few texts which seemed kind of personal letters of people a little bit further down the social scale. They're rarer, partly because we have so many letters of Cerealis because a large number of his papers were thrown away all in one go. He kept an archive of his incoming and outgoing material. That was all thrown away when that unit left the fort, so that's why we have so many of those letters. Whereas the sort of everyday soldier is probably not keeping an archive of all of their material, so it's a little bit harder to see them. But Roman soldiers, they were even rank and file, they were taught how to read and write as part of their service. So there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to send letters to each other, and indeed we do find that a little bit as well. So this is tablet 311. And this is a very strange letter. This is actually quite difficult to get the tone, and I think shows the difficulty of kind of reconstructing history and personal stories from this kind of evidence, because it's very partial, right? We're looking into a sort of private world of one-to-one correspondence in which you are not the intended recipient, and the author expects you to know all kinds of things like relationships and references to everyday stuff that we simply don't know. So here we see Solemnis to Paris, his brother. Very many greetings. I want you to know that I am in very good health, as I hope you are in turn, you neglectful man, who have not sent me even one letter. But I think that I'm behaving in a more considerate fashion in writing to you, brother, my messmate. Greet from me Diligens and Cogitatus and Corinthus, and I ask that you send me the names, presumably other names of people that he knows who are still at the fort. Farewell, dearest brother. I mean, we get a sense. I mean, you could read this as a real sort of telling off of, you haven't written to me at all, but look, I'm still writing to you. Or it could be a sort of playful sort of satire. They're joking with each other. We don't exactly know, and it's impossible for us to tell for sure. Tone is often very difficult to get if you're not actually one of these people. Interesting here just to note the names. All of these soldiers, like I said, they were non-Romans. They will have been given a Greco-Roman name on joining up. So all the names we see here, Solemnis, Paris, Diligens, Cogitatus, they will not have had those names when they were in their tribes before they joined up. They will have had some kind of local names. And it's interesting to see the sort of names that they get. Diligens, that's a very common soldier name. Diligent, sort of hardworking. Cogitatus, Mr. Thoughtful. Corinthus, Mr. Corinth, Mr. Greece, slightly strange. And then, of course, the person being written to here is Paris, a name from Greco-Roman mythology. One of the first things that these soldiers would do when they were signed up is probably, again, taught to read and write through writing out classical texts. Here it's perhaps slightly unsurprising that this guy has taken a name for himself, or perhaps he's been given it by his kind of instructor, of a name from one of the foundational texts of sort of Greco-Roman mythology. We also have a few letters which seem to be between family members of the soldiers and the soldiers themselves, often sending them equipment, going kind of both ways. Sometimes soldiers send money back to their family. Sometimes their family is sending them things to help them. And we know that this is happening from other evidence from Egypt as well. So this is from tablet 346, where we read, I have sent you some pairs of socks, 2 pairs of sandals, 2 pairs of underpants, 2 pairs of sandals. So all very useful things for, I don't know why pairs of sandals is there twice, but all very useful things. Perhaps, forgot that they already written that. All things that would be very, very useful on the frontier. So you can see the kind of bleed over of private and public, because Roman soldiers, they were not given as standard issue all of their equipment in this period. They had to purchase it out of their salary. Basically, they were given allowance for it. If you could get your family to send you some equipment, then you get to keep more of that money for spending on alcohol or whatever else they did. So that could be quite useful. Okay, this is a big text. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time with this because this is one of my favorite tablets. And this shows us something else going on at the fort, which is that there are non-military figures, so civilians, who are engaged very closely in the running of the fort, which is something, again, that you wouldn't necessarily get without this evidence. And it's very interesting because, again, the traditional picture of the Roman army is it's very self-sufficient. It does everything in-house. If it needs to build something, it gets its own engineers to do it. Whereas actually the Vindolanda evidence shows us a much more mixed society in which lots of civilians and perhaps some local people are doing some work for the army. So we'll read through this, tablet 343. And so this is from, I think, there is a bit of debate over this, but I think this is from one of these civilian contractors who is helping supply the army. So we read, Octavius to his brother Candidus, greetings. The £100 of sinew for Marinus I will settle up. From the time when you wrote about this matter, he has not even mentioned it to me. I have several times written to you that I have bought about 5,000 modii of ears of grain. That's about, oh gosh, I don't know, 50,000 liters of grain, something like that. On account of which I need cash. Unless you send me some cash, at least 500 denarii, which is well more than, it's probably about 2 years' salary for an average worker there, 500 denarii. So, yeah, 50, something like 50, 60,000 pounds if we were to just kind of extrapolate that to today. The result will be that I shall lose what I've laid as a deposit, about 300 denarii, and I shall be embarrassed. So I ask you, send me some cash as soon as possible. The hides which you write are at Caractonium, write that they be given to me, and the wagon about which you write, and write to me what is with the wagon. Then we see we can skip on a bit. He complains about the roads being bad, which is why he hasn't already been out there. He says, I've already finished threshing all I have. He's complaining about somebody didn't come to meet him. And then finally, I hear that Frontinus Julius, this is at the bottom, has for sale at a high price leather, which he bought here for 5 denarii apiece. So complaining that someone else has bought something from him and is now selling it for much more, saying, this is or we did bad business here. We could have sold it for more. And then finally, greet Spectatus and Firmus. I've received letters from Gloico. Farewell. Deliver at Vindolanda. So what we see here, I mean, it's a complex text. There's a ton of different information sort of dealt with in here. And Octavius sort of jumps from different financial matters, which he clearly expects Candidus to be aware of. And I think what we see here is a civilian, an entrepreneurial civilian, who is clearly engaged in a kind of a major financial operation of supplying the army. Because there's no other reason that you would need 5,000 modii of grain. I mean, unless you're doing wholesale supply for the fort. And clearly it's on his own initiative. He's not employed by the army because he says there, unless you send me the money, I'm going to lose a deposit and I'm going to be embarrassed. So he's not using someone else's money here. It's his own, he's on the line, right? So I think we see here, we get an insight into the kind of support structure and the vast train of people beyond the soldiers who would have been involved in keeping the army going. This is another letter which we don't need to look at too much. This seems to suggest actually that there's even sort of family businesses going on. Again, seems to be referring to civilian suppliers of the army who are working with the Kaiseriani, who are officials of the emperor. And there seems to be a father-son relationship going here as well. So that even a family business kind of supporting the army. But this kind of thing could also go wrong. Obviously, working for the army could be a very lucrative business for those who went into it. But as you can imagine, it could also bring a little bit of danger as well. And this is a fascinating document which we have, which is probably from another one of these people, another one of these civilian contractors, who's complaining about having been beaten up, probably by a centurion. And this is a draft petition. So he was going to submit this to somebody in high office to complain about it. And he complains here, he says, he beat me all the more and poured my goods down the drain. As befits an honest man, I implore your majesty not to allow me, an innocent man, to have been beaten with rods. And, my lord, inasmuch as I was unable to complain to the prefect because he was detained by ill health, I've complained in vain to the beneficiarius and the rest of the centurions of his unit. Accordingly, I implore your mercifulness not to allow me, a man from overseas and an innocent one, to have been bloodied by rods as if I had committed some crime. So what seems to have happened here is this guy was one of these civilian contractors who was kind of selling grain to the army. And actually on the back of this document, there's an inventory of grain disbursements that this person has made to various soldiers. That seems to be what's happening. And clearly one of the centurions took a disliking to him, beat him up. And we see here that he was unable to complain to the prefect. He tried to, but the prefect was, supposedly ill, so wouldn't hear his complaint. And now he's writing a petition that could be going to. So he calls the person he's writing to here, Your Majesty, must be more senior than the prefect, because he just said the prefect hasn't listened to my problem. It could be the governor of Britain. But some people have suggested it could even be meant for the Emperor Hadrian, because this tablet was written around about 120, 122. This is exactly the time when Hadrian was visiting Britain, supervising the construction of his wall, which was happening just a mile north of Vindolanda, and which men from the fort were certainly involved with. So we get a real kind of cross section of society and different jobs that are going on there. And this is just to take us back to that picture of the fort, and actually, thinking about this mixed society, mixed economy, and all the civilians who would have been living there. Some of them families of the soldiers, but many of them doing economic tasks, salesmen, contractors, etc., who we can see archaeologically are living right outside the fort walls. I mean, so this is the fort itself, obviously, this classic kind of playing card orientation of a Roman fort. And out of the front gate is this what are called an extramural settlement, and outside the settlement outside the walls, a civilian settlement that's kind of sprung up right outside the walls of the fort, with all kinds of workshops and shops and inns, and probably some less salubrious places as well, and granaries, and all of this, and we can see that very clearly in the archaeological record too. And this is a artist's rendition, not of Vindolanda, but of a fort a little bit further along Hadrian's Wall, Burdeswald. And there you can see again, we have this civilian settlement called a vicus outside of the gates, in comparison to the very sort of regimented interior of the fort. And that bit in the middle, this is the commander's house. So this is where he lives. That was a little sort of insight into some of the stuff that's preserved there. But what else can we sort of tell from this site? What kind of history can we write that we can sort of generalize out? Well, Vindolanda, again, we find lots of material here that you don't find anywhere else because of that unique site. It's not just the tablets, it's not just the leather, but lots of other things as well. Lots of evidence for food consumption, animal bones, where we can tell what the sort of what the diet of the soldiers was. There's some remarkable, quite disgusting archaeological finds of kind of human waste and human remains, by which again we can tell about the diet and also the diseases that were carried by these people. Famously, archaeologists at Vindolanda discovered a particular type of tapeworm that was probably transferred in this fish sauce, uncooked fish sauce, which the Romans were bizarrely fond of, which was transported across the empire. So this was just a vector for terrible diseases, which made its way to the northern border. But we can also see evidence for settlement patterns changing over time, like we just said, evidence for friction and cooperation with local populations. Some really extraordinary finds from some sites as well. Really one-off stuff that's just feels like you're really getting back to some kind of crazy personal story. This is the fort of Housesteads, which is just north of Hadrian, of Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall. You can actually see the wall there running behind it. And this was another fort which had a ricus outside it, a civilian settlement. You can see some of the buildings here. And on this building here, which this is the best quality image I could find of a close-up, not very good, so I'll go back to this one. But it's this building in the bottom right register here. So this was clearly a bar because the large number of gambling tokens were found under the floor in the main room. But under the front room were two bodies that would people who had clearly been murdered, and actually there was a knife found with them and hidden under the floor by the proprietor. So evidence here for a crime committed 2,000 years ago that was presumably successfully kind of hushed up in antiquity, but then discovered by modern archaeologists. So, I mean, you get a sense that these places probably be pretty dangerous. And you think about the depiction of frontier societies in sort of American westerns or something. I mean, that's the kind of society we're talking about here. And then there's also a change over time aspect here as well. I mean, I already talked about the sort of rebuilding of these forts in the 2nd, 3rd century in stone. But what happens later? And there's evidence here we can see in these here for what happens in late antiquity when the army, first of all, starts to withdraw from the north and then leaves entirely. So actually, one of the interesting things about Housesteads is we see here, I mean, it's all these nice sort of rectangular traditional buildings that have been excavated, but there's also lots of evidence here that after these buildings were knocked down, they were replaced by kind of local round huts. And probably the army is still active in this period. They date to the 4th century, but the army is much smaller. Lots of troops have left. And it seems that all of the people, including the civilians outside, so the soldiers and their families, moved inside the fort and into these new round buildings. So we see settlement patterns changing as political conditions change. And then finally, this is an artist's impression of what happens at this fort, Burdeswald, after the Romans leave, which is that the site doesn't become unoccupied. Actually, some of the soldiers probably stay even after the Roman army officially leaves. And it immediately becomes a kind of local stronghold for essentially a local warlord. And they build what looks very much like a kind of sort of medieval hall. If you've watched I completely forgot The Last Kingdom or something, one of those halls where they're all having their feasts in the old granary of the fort, and it remained in constant use. So there's an immediate sort of reuse by post-Roman society, which is a whole sort of period which archaeologists have historically been much less interested in, but sure has a lot of very similarly exciting stories to reveal to us if archaeologists looked in a bit more detail at that stuff and didn't just sort of destroy it and then rebuilt the classical high 1st, 2nd century material, which is what all the tourists want to see. So that's what I've that's the kind of end of all the material I had prepared. Just before we finish, I just want to show you how you can kind of pick through this data by yourself. Molly, just to check, can you see my browser screen here? Yep. So all of the material that I've just shown you now is hosted online on this site, Roman Inscriptions of Britain. And Roman Inscriptions of Britain is, as you would imagine, is a compendium of all the inscriptions from Roman Britain, which started out decades ago as enormous printed volumes, but has now all been digitized on this website, and it has everything from Romans of Britain Volume 1, which is all the inscriptions on stone, Roman in Britain, and then Volume 2 and 3, which are on different materials. So there's stuff on metal, etc. In this, and then all of the Vindolanda tablets are digitized here, and all of the Bloomberg tablets, which are writing tablets from Roman London, have also been preserved. So if I were to go, and you can either search, if you happen to know the identifier of a particular inscription, you can do that, or you can search a key term. So I'm searching for Regina, Queen, just to find a famous inscription. This Roman inscription is of Britain 1065, which is a very famous funerary inscription, which is now at South Shields. Which is, and you can see here, this is what the page looks like. You've got all the information on where it was found, how big it is. You've got the Latin, which you can display in various ways. You've got the translation, and then you have commentary, notes, and modern bibliography. So this is a really, really useful resource to kind of pick through this kind of material. And this is a really interesting inscription because this is a grave inscription for a local woman called Regina, Queen. And the inscription says, "Diem, dis manibus, to the shades of the departed." That's a normal kind of Latin funerary formula. Regina, liberta, so freed woman, and wife, conjunx, of Barathes, the Palmyrene, so he's from Syria, the husband, and then it gives the name of the tribe which Regina belonged to. So she's a local woman, and says that she lived 30 years. And then it's underneath in Palmyrene script. There's a kind of bilingual element here as well. So this gives an insight into a wonderful kind of social history, personal story. Barathes is from Syria, from Palmyra. He's come to Britain, perhaps on army business. He's married a local woman who's probably a slave that he freed in order to marry. But just so obviously there are dark elements here as well. But just the amount of sort of social detail we can get out of these texts is really extraordinary. And you can have a look at this on your own time as well. And if you want to go through, Vindolanda Tablets, you can have a look at that. And there's all of these kind of summaries that show all the material that's there, and you can click through and see the translations, and of course the Latin of these texts and pictures. So just a little insight into the types of tools that we kind of have now for you guys to explore this kind of stuff from your home. So I recommend that you go and have a little look round and see if there's anything there that strikes your fancy. If there's anything that's really interesting about Vindolanda that I missed out, because we all have our own particular interests that you think I should have focused on. Yeah, this is exactly the kind of stuff that is useful to sort of beef up your personal statements with. Have a little explore on your own terms and get to grips with some ancient sources.